How are we doing today? Welcome back or welcome to the channel if you're new. Like and subscribe if you like these videos so you can catch them when I finish them up and post them. So today we're looking at axles and carriers. So we had this bike come in with a axle bearing failure. First it sounded like a transmission, then looking at it closer, I found that the clicking was coming from the carrier, and surprisingly, it wasn't more noticeable on the bike. But this carrier bearing completely wiped out. They tend to fail on the drive side first, and then on the brake side after. This one's a pretty good mess, but fortunately the axle is usable and wasn't damaged. It had enough rust on the bearing to the axle that it didn't spin. Most of the time they destroy themselves and destroy the axle. But I wanted to show you what's going on, because funny thing is I have the same carrier here, new, that I had a customer bring in, as the carrier that came out of this bike. Now this carrier didn't look very old. You can kind of tell that it wasn't too old by the it still got a little bit of shine on the not completely oxidized, so that can't be more than a year old, and that bearing is completely failed. So grabbing this other carrier and looking at it, I saw the problem, and the problem is it's all Chinese. That's number one problem. The second problem is the people selling it don't give a crap. And the third problem is the guys buying it don't know, don't care, they just want a cheap price. So they're buying it as cheap as possible. People are selling it as cheap as possible. And the people making it, well, they don't care. They're in a different country. So they're making it because people are buying it, and the people selling it are happy because people are buying it. And nobody gives a crap. Ultimately, the customer or the end user gets screwed on the deal, because they get a wiped out axle and get to spend money at a shop fixing their stuff. So basically, what you have here is bearing. You have a crush tube in the center, another bearing. This is a new bearing I put on there. Your brake hub, and then the axle nut. So what goes on as you tighten this axle nut down? This brake hub pushes against the bearing, and it is pushing against the inside race of the bearing. This piece, that's the inside of the bearing. So it's pushing against that, which is pushing pressure on this, pushing pressure on this bearing up against the sprocket side. So this needs to have a fluid tension across it. As it gets torqued down, it's going to have tension there. Now the issue comes into play, and you end up looking like that. That inner race is in there. The issue is, as you tighten this together, this bearing doesn't have very little side-to-side thrust. Only what the looseness of the balls inside the cage are. So there's very little side-to-side. So the spec of where this bearing's placed in the carrier, as far as how far down it goes, how far this lip down in the carrier is, compared to the width of the crush tube, which is that piece, needs to be exact, or within I would say needs to be within 20 thou, which pretty tight tolerance for something pretty generic. and probably even tighter. So here's a stock carrier. This one's been well used and rusty, but if I shake it like a shake weight, right? That inner tube doesn't rattle, which means that there is no play between the center tube and the bearing. And the bearings are pressed down into the carrier all the way down, and they stop on this lip. The outer sleeve here, or the outer race, is going to stop on that lip. So when you torque that, there needs to not be preload on this bearing. You can't have this outer bottomed out in the housing and then put pressure on the center. So the issue is with what I noticed with this Chinese carrier, and these are cast, these are not billet. These are a cast piece that is machined. So some people are selling them as billets, but they are not. So the issue was, and hopefully you can see it here, when I dropped that crush tube down in there is a height difference between, let's see, what can I use? Maybe I'll try this pin. There is a height difference between the top of this tube and where the bearing sits. So that's about 1/8 of an inch. If I draw across there, pretty big difference. Let's see if I can get something better to give you an idea. Okay, well there. The top of this Allen wrench still does not come to the top of where the bearing would stop. And that's a 4mm. So you got like 175 thou difference. So basically, most likely what happened with this customer is most likely they put this axle together, ran it for a little bit, and their axle nut came loose. And they're like, well, crap, my axle nut is loose, let me tighten it in. And they'll tighten it in, and it'll get loose again. And what's happening is the bearing is failing as they're crushing that center together. So this is the aftermarket tube. You happen to set it next to a stock tube, and that's your height difference. That's the fix. That's the whole issue. The whole issue why this failed is somebody's tape measure in China does not work. So who knows why or how, but you drop that in and you relook at it. It comes up to the proper height within range. Leaves a little bit of room for this tube to get some pressure on it, crush a little bit, and for the bearing to not quite bottom out on this edge. So it'll be real close. That's what we're gonna do. Just use that OEM sleeve in this carrier. So what I noticed out of the box though, when I grabbed this carrier and the bearing was in it, is I picked it up and this center tube was just clunking around there, doing that, and that's what kind of caught my eye or caught my ear, that something was wrong with that. And then looking at it now, putting everything side by side, looking at this identical carrier that failed, there's your answer. So check your stuff, make sure that the spread is right on this. There is a lot of different bearing sizes, but this bearing that they're using here is 24mm wide. The older stock bearings are a dual row bearing, but they're 12mm a piece. So this bearing is made to replace the two bearings. So the newer 13 and above carriers, they use this double row bearing and everything works as it should. So that's what I got for you today. I hope this helps somebody, guys having issues with the lock nut coming loose or slop in the axle. I would check that carrier. Try to buy quality stuff. I know it's that extra money is tough to put out there sometimes, but it's for a good reason. Otherwise, you may have an axle that looks like this. So that's it for today. Keep the shiny side up, and we'll catch you on the next one.